Here we go, Meg.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a great program for you this evening featuring Amanda Oliver, here to talk about her new book, Overdue, Reckoning with the Public Library. A couple of brief housekeeping notes. First, though, to post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Overdue. Now, Amanda's a writer who also worked as a librarian in low-income neighborhoods here in Washington, D.C. for nearly 7 years. Her book is partly a memoir about her experiences in libraries and partly an examination of the problems facing libraries. As Amanda asserts at the start, many of us have rather outdated or overly romanticized views of public libraries, viewing them as tranquil, pleasant community centers filled with books and offering cultural events. In reality, Amanda argues, public libraries have become caught up in a number of societal ills and often bear the brunt of such problems as violence, inequality, homelessness, drug addiction, and inadequate mental health care. Further, in many cases, libraries are woefully under-resourced to deal with these challenges. Amanda's book has been described in reviews as both a love letter and a call to action about libraries. And readers have predicted the book will leave people never seeing libraries the same way again after they read Amanda's book. So I think we're in for quite a revealing discussion this evening. Conversation with Amanda will be Meg Metcalf, who works at the Library of Congress as a reference librarian specializing in women's, gender, and LGBTQIA+ studies. So Amanda and Meg, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad. I want to start the evening just by thanking the folks at Politics and Prose, including Brad, for hosting us tonight. When I was a school librarian in DC, Politics and Prose hosted several fundraisers for the libraries where I worked. So it's a bookstore that is especially dear to my heart. And it's also just one of my favorite bookstores in the world. And it's such a pleasure and really a dream come true to be hosted by them tonight. I also want to thank Meg Metcalf for being in conversation with me tonight. Meg and I have been friends on the internet for many years now, and they have been such a comforting and supportive person in my life, both in the years that I was working in libraries and in the 3 years since I've left the profession. For those of you joining us tonight who are librarians, you hopefully know the joy of finding someone within the profession who is a confidant and a true friend. I feel like Meg is all of those things. And not only that, they echo and understand many of my feelings and thoughts and experiences around libraries and library work. And they also push me and so many others to think more critically about so much. So it means a great deal to me to be able to do this event with someone who is still so deeply steeped in library work in a city that I love and called home for so many years. So my gratitude is unending to Meg for being with me tonight, and also to all of you here who are ready to dig into not just Overdue, but a larger conversation around libraries and library work. So I'm going to pass it on to Meg now. Thanks so much to everyone for being here.
You are so sweet, and I'm glad that I have a lot of praise to now give you, because I have been waiting for this book to be born. I feel like a proud auntie of this book. And by the way, auntie is gender neutral, for anyone wondering. I honestly don't know that I have, sorry, get it in frame. I honestly don't know that I have the words to express how important this book is and how much it means not just to me, but to all library workers and to everyone who cares about libraries and believes in them as a social good. As you write so eloquently, Amanda, the things we're going to talk about tonight are very complicated to hear and very complicated to share. And I just really appreciate what an amazing intersectional view of power and privilege in the library your book is, because that's a very complicated thing to try to explain to someone. And we really do need that because we need to talk about our love for libraries and how this love is actually pretty toxic relationship. And this book just ignites this crucial conversation about the state of public libraries in the US right now, and begins my favorite word, it's on the cover, a reckoning that includes finally an acknowledgement for all library workers who have faced or are currently facing trauma at work in its many forms, and who are feeling, as you know, the respondents in your survey reported, burned out, unsupported, and unsafe. And I don't think those are three words that people would associate with the public library, but that certainly seems to be a consensus among librarians, both in your survey and in our personal experiences. So in the face of all of this, though, your book feels like this amazing call. Not only is it an acknowledgement that we all need, but it's a call for us all to connect. It's a call for library workers to connect to each other. And it's especially a call for communities to connect with us and to connect with libraries and to invest in them, because that's the only way forward. And as much as this book is about systemic inequality and failure and late stage capitalism, I also found so much hope here. Hope in the form of community care and mutual aid and reckoning and transparency. So on that note, let the reckoning begin. I thought we would start tonight by talking about how libraries are dangerous, and how that's a phrase that many people would just laugh at, but that's something that you and I and library workers everywhere know deep in their bones to be true. So let's talk a little bit about that for people who haven't yet picked up a copy of the book from their independent bookstore and don't know how libraries could possibly be dangerous. Amanda, do you have some examples for us of how libraries are dangerous, especially for the people who work in them?
Yeah, and I hope everyone can tell now why I'm so excited to talk to Meg. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and that high praise of OVERDUE. Some of you may have read that chapter 1 of the book was excerpted recently, and this really digs into establishing some of what Meg just said. So there was a quote from a 2020 survey that I conducted with librarians, that parts of it are included in the book. That was the safe place sticker on the window is cosmetic. And so this concept, I remember reading that response, and that sort of stopping me in my tracks. And the library I worked in have that sticker on the glass, but that's sort of an assumption that lots of times we make about libraries, that you're going to walk in and it's a safe place. And I think what, Meg, you're kind of getting at, and I'm really excited to dig into with you, is that it's sometimes that it's a safe place more so for the patrons than it necessarily is for the people who are manning public libraries and working in them. And I know you put together a great list of some examples for folks who are sitting here maybe confused about, you need to unpack for us what can be unsafe about library spaces.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues that we first bonded on, I mean, there are so many forms of trauma that happen in libraries, from witnessing domestic violence to being a victim of that violence yourself. I feel like I know so many librarians who have been stalked by people. And a big issue is sexual harassment. It's huge. It's a huge issue. In fact, most of the women and AFAB people that I know wear a wedding ring on the desk, whether or not they're married or not, because sexual harassment it's a pandemic in libraries. And and often people are told that there's really nothing that you can do, and you are being sexually harassed at work on a frequent, sometimes daily basis. And, where is the administrative response? I was wondering if in your research, you have ever seen a library that responded positively or even appropriately to this situation of harassment in libraries, because I don't think that I have.
Yeah, I mean, in conversations that I've privately had with librarians and some interviews that I did, and then certainly in the survey responses, I saw a sort of universal thread of not feeling supported in some of the most difficult situations. And in my own experience and in the opening of the book, I chose to open with a scene where I was sexually harassed by a patron. And when I brought that to my manager, just having them have a response that was really, really upsetting and really paved the way. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks into working the job, and it just paved the way for understanding that if something and when something like that happened again, that I was not going to be able to turn to the person in leadership for help. And that was a common thread, like I said, that I kept finding in surveys, was people saying that they either didn't feel supported at the manager level, or certainly across the board, that administrators and people who were, above any sort of managers, that there was a lack of support at that level, which is, of course, crushing when you are the sort of boots on the ground person who has to return to the workforce every day, knowing that there's a possibility of facing that again, knowing that there may be particular patrons who you've had this behavior happen repeatedly, and you're not getting whatever support you need to prevent that from happening again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I feel like so much of the reason that we can't fix this is because there is, as you say, no transparency here. We aren't really allowed to talk about these experiences that we are having. And I think, your book is such a call to end this culture of silence in libraries. And it's just I just find that to be so powerful and so healing for me personally, because it makes me feel like, we can take a step forward, here. But how can our communities, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, keep going.
How can our communities who love the library and who think of it as this ideal place that it really is not for its workers, how can our communities support policies and library boards and politicians that work for positive change in libraries if they can't actually know what's going on? Because you and I know that most librarians end up signing some form of NDA so how is the community supposed to help the library if they're not allowed to know how dangerous it really is?
And I think that's a really interesting piece, and I'm glad we're touching on that early. Most people do not know that, nor will they. It's not a willful ignorance, but it's most people don't realize that, and that you are sometimes legally prevented from talking about certain things. So there is a reason that OVERDUE was only able to come out once I had left the profession. And part of the reason I wrote it was because I understood that there were so many people who couldn't say what I wanted to say. And of course, we get bits and pieces of it. And you are an amazing advocate and very vocal to the extent that you can be. But I don't think people realize, yes, that librarians, there are whole legal departments in public library systems. There are NDAs, there are legally binding government oaths that you recite that you are not able to talk about certain things. And you're absolutely right, is how are we supposed to allow the general public who love libraries and love librarians, how are we able to give them the space to help and support if they're not able to get a full picture of what is happening? And that's come up a bunch in different conversations and interviews that I've had of, why didn't you interview more librarians. And the thing is, I did. I interviewed hundreds of librarians, and I sent out a very well thought out survey with many questions. And again, the concern was, I'm afraid to answer this because I don't know what the backlash is going to be, or I can tell you what state I'm a librarian in, but I can't tell you which city. Follow-up emails of, are you sure this is anonymous? I regret saying that because I'm worried. And so I ultimately made the decision that any punishment that came against me is not the same as what would have happened if someone who was still working in libraries wrote this book. And quite frankly, legally, they wouldn't have been able to write this book.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm in thinking about the silencing of library workers, it's, it really gets to me at my core. I mean, there has already been backlash against your book before it was even published. You're getting all sorts of emails. And it just, it really begs the question, why are so people threatened with knowing what happens at a public library? I mean, I'm so curious about your experience with this because, I've been promoting the book as much as I can. I'm so excited about it. And even I have been getting, messages from people who have told me they have no plan to read the book, but that they are against it. How dare you speak out against the library? And so much of it just is, in my opinion, feels very sexist because it's the way that it's almost akin to how an abuser tries to silence victims. It's like, you've experienced this abuse, but how dare you speak about it? And I just feel like that has to be, I feel like this is such a heavy question, but would you mind speaking about the backlash at all? Because I do feel like that's an important piece of this.
Yeah, I think you said one thing that was really important in all of it, and just my own sort of coping. And I've had years now, which I'll backtrack in a minute. But just in the immediate, a lot of it was concern or anger, and from people who hadn't read the book yet, or maybe had seen a piece of it or had an idea of what was going to be in the book and hadn't read it. And like you said, some of them have communicated that they're never going to. And I think that is absolutely their right, but they are missing some essential pieces. And obviously the book goes so far beyond just my personal experience at one particular branch in one particular city. It spans centuries. So there's that leg of it. And I can speak to, when I first started writing about libraries publicly and had left the profession, I would inevitably get an email from an editor after a piece published saying that someone had reached out from the library system to say that I was lying or had said something incorrectly. And I would quietly, privately gather evidence to the contrary. And I had to each time submit evidence to the editors to pass along so that they didn't have to make redactions or corrections. And that first happened, I think, 4 years ago, or maybe 3. And so it was good sort of preparation for what was to come, and sort of thickening up my skin, and ultimately understanding that the reason the subtitle has reckoning in it is there has to be a reckoning. And I think for many people, that's a very scary thing. But to me, a reckoning can actually lead to some of the most joyful, peaceful work that we can do moving forward. But it does involve pain. It perhaps involves hurt feelings. It definitely involves anger. But I think all of that is essential to eventually reaching a point where we can have a more collective, shared understanding and truth. And certainly nothing I have ever written or said around libraries is meant to demonize or publicly shame anyone. That is not the intention behind it. My goal is always just to get a more accurate story out there so that people, especially librarians and library workers, feel heard and feel seen in the nature of the work they're doing. And I've also had the absolute pleasure of the many emails that I received from librarians saying, thank you so much for this work. I finally feel like my story is out there, people giving me their phone number and their email address saying, will you call me? I feel like you understand and I just want to hear from you. And so when I get that confirmation again and again, it becomes even more perplexing to me that anyone at any level would want to stop the sharing of these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And something from the book that you talked about too is that we can't really even begin to deal with all of these issues internally in the library because we're so busy also fighting external threats. So it's not just that we're dealing with trauma, inside the library as workers with each other, with administrators who don't want us to speak our truth, who would like us to remain silent, not our thing. And so that actually it kind of leads into another huge part of your book that about libraries as a place where people meet their basic needs. And I think there's probably no more powerful example of that than you give or that I can think of than unhoused people using the library to meet their basic needs. So I'm kind of shifting here. Like, why do we think, why have so many libraries across the US? Again, this is not just DC, this is across the US. Libraries have become safe spaces, safe havens, sanctuaries for marginalized people, but especially unhoused folks that use it for so many things. But how exactly did this happen? I know you had to do a lot of research in terms of the defunding of mental health services here in the US. And I'm sure that was pretty heavy stuff. So how did this happen? How did libraries try to do so much with so little that they became so dangerous,
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, it's much deeper than something that's just happening in libraries. It's happening across the country and it's definitely systemic. So just for readers who have copies of Overdue or are planning to pick one up, chapter 6 of the book is called Cold Mercy, and it covers this particular topic extensively. And I can certainly speak to it a bit here, but part of the reason I wrote the book is just the amount of research that was required to sort of tap into this this question and answer is immense. So if you are looking, if this piques your interest, chapter 6 is where to head in the book. But I sort of talk about a lot in the book that I'm a question and answers person. And when I answer one question, the next thing that comes up for me is another question. And I think that's a librarian brain type thing. So, the question for me that follows, why do US libraries often function as day shelters, more or less? And the subsequent question is, how did houselessness become so rampant in America? And that history is very extensive and involved more research than I'm able to recite here, but a big piece of it is that in the 60s and 70s, there was a huge push for the deinstitutionalization and shifting of the locus of care to the community, into a community that was not adequately prepared for such a responsibility. So good intentions behind that of deinstitutionalization, after learning just how horrible mental health institutions could be, shift towards community locus of care, and the community was not prepared for that. And so where we're at now is sort of a decentralized mental health system. And that has predominantly benefited middle-class people with less severe disorders who are able to re-enter their homes and their communities more easily. And there are just layers to this, especially in DC. But one of the biggest takeaways in my research into all this that I think should just be much more common knowledge is that the 3 largest public mental health providers in America are correctional systems. So they are Los Angeles County, Rikers Island in New York, and Cook County in Illinois near Chicago. So that gives us a lot of information about that. But yes, chapter 6 is the place to head if you are interested in the much longer, more in-depth answer to how we got a place, and of course, addiction and incarceration and mental health and houselessness are all so intimately tied to each other in this country.
And I think people don't necessarily realize what the majority maybe of library users are using the library for. This is the only place unhoused people can go and have a shower and be in a climate controlled environment for filling out job applications. I mean, filling out any sort of form at all, having internet access, having access to clean drinking water is a huge one. So we want them there, of course, but when librarians go to library school, we are not trained as social workers, unfortunately, and we don't have the background and the training to help people who are having a psychotic episode or are overdosing. And these are things we have both seen. This is not uncommon. This is probably the most common experience across libraries. So some of the programs that I've seen a few. I don't think that I would have one that I would hold up and say, they're doing it right. Because it seems like we get these pilot programs that last for a little bit of time, like a social worker will be installed in the library, and then that could maybe help, but it never seems to get the resources and the funding that story time or any other event for average middle class white America would get. Libraries aren't really advocating resources for their biggest population, which is marginalized folks. So that's kind of two parts. That's sort of how are we allocating our resources, because that tells you who libraries are really for in terms of who the administrators, who the library board, that's who they think the library is for. So watch the funding. But my main question is, have you seen any library that has done something with installing a social worker, and did they fully fund it in the end? And do you think it was successful? Have you seen anything in all your research?
Yeah, I have lots to say about librarian social workers. So the very first library social worker in the United States was Leah Esguerra, who is at the San Francisco Public Library. I'm sure you know Leah, Meg. And Leah came in and has done some phenomenal work. She is still there as far as I know. And actually DC is one of the first public library systems in the country to also bring in a social worker or somebody with their MSW to come in. And I can speak to that a bit in seeing that in practice. So DC has 28 branches, and this person is one person serving 28 branches. So at the point where they were assigned to the branch where I worked, they were there for a month, 1 day a week with a team of volunteers. And they're a wonderful person. The team was great, but immediately we discovered that the space was not conducive to this kind of care. The branch where I worked was one large open space with no private meeting rooms. And so they were sat at a table where patrons would have to visibly in front of everyone approach this table to receive those services, which from a dignity and pride standpoint for many of them, it did not happen. And so the days that I was there, that they were also in attendance, I saw them, sit at that table and wait for folks to come up and not come up. And that's one very specific example with my branch. But I think if we look at 28 branches, one person with a small team, it's very hard to be successful in that capacity. Denver Public Library is another one that I believe has 2 library social workers, but I think it's the reason behind it is wonderful, but certainly the numbers are not enough to provide the amount of care that's needed. Yeah. And I think that's where another thing that popped up for me as you were talking, Meg, is just some fundamental changes in MLS programs in this country to include either a combined MSW MLS degree, or having folks from a social work program coming and teaching courses within an MLS, but just a fundamental shifting in how we teach folks how to be librarians, and how we talk about what the true nature of the work is, and what it involves. But to answer your sort of overarching question, there are humans behind libraries who care very, very deeply. And all across the country, there are libraries and librarians trying out all different programs and trainings and things to help as best they can. But until you have the money and the administrative support, those are always going to fall short. And unfortunately, I feel like what happens there is that, at least for me, I can say, and I think for you, the onus falls on the librarians, and that is a very defeating, heartbreaking position to be in.
Absolutely. I don't think people realize that the sort of library rules of behavior and the codes of conduct that we have are set by administrators who maybe spend little to no time in the library and don't have never worked a reference desk, have no idea the reality of working on a reference desk in a library. And then, to have to enforce that as a librarian when you know that these policies lack empathy is a very, very hard position to be in. And what's worse is that we see that the sort of backlash to social progress and the way that it's hitting libraries, not only just trying to ban and censor, what's happening, with library books, but they're also trying to ban and censor the kinds of programming and the kinds of services that we can offer. Because when I tried to go, I was reading your book and I was so inspired with these talks about how much less it would be to fund something like a needle exchange program or showers or lockers. That's a lot less expensive than, a couple $100 million renovation. But we don't, those choices aren't made by us. We can't ask them, to make those choices. So, and to find that some local governments and library boards have actually banned that because librarians kept saying, can we get a needle exchange? And they went so far as to make it illegal, saying that it encouraged drug use. So not only are we not getting the resources that we need, but we are actively fighting against legislation here in these states and in these counties that make it impossible for that positive change to happen.
I think renovations are a good place to look if you're curious to see confirmation of a lot of what Meg and I are talking about tonight, just as libraries are being renovated and millions of dollars are being put into them, what's not being put in, which is what you're pointing out. So lockers for people's belongings so that they don't have to leave them outside where they can be stolen, clean needle exchanges, showers. There is a clear ignoring of whole huge swaths of populations of people who are using libraries, and that is reflected in the millions, sometimes billions of dollars that are poured into renovations that don't take the majority population of people who are using those library spaces into account at all. And you're absolutely right. I think maybe it would be said that librarians are given an opportunity to share their ideas, but I don't know that those ideas are listened to or taken into account.
Absolutely. I feel like so often when change is happening in libraries, it's happening from a political level or from an administrative level, and librarians are in a position to react, and they're not usually, and front of house staff at the library are the first to deal with these dangerous conditions. They're the first to deal with the dangers of COVID, but they don't actually get to input the service models. They don't get to decide when the library stays open and when it is closed. So that's a pretty hard position to be in. And I think that, among other things, has led to so much burnout in our profession. And I think it's time we can talk about the pandemic and how it's changed the nature of work for many librarians, but I don't know that it's changed libraries all that much. I think it's made things a little bit worse, or maybe a lot of it worse. But it's making visible some of these issues that we knew that libraries already had, such as safety, right? So from my perspective and my experience, I feel like burnout among librarians is at an all-time high. Morale is at an all-time low. You have people leaving the profession in droves. And if you don't believe me, go to Twitter, hashtag protect library workers, check it out. I'm sure there's other ones. There's LIS, mental health, check it out. But so do you, in talking to all these librarians across the country in all these different kinds of libraries, do you get the impression that librarians, like educators across the nation, have pretty much had it?
Yeah, I do get that impression, and I think that has been building for a long time. And right, so ultimately, there are several reasons that I left library work, and one of them was to go focus on being a writer. But the biggest one was the toll that it took on my own mental health and the burnout and empathy fatigue that I experienced. And at the time, I felt very, very alone in that. And then in the years since leaving and in conducting interviews and just talking to librarians, it is much more the consensus than I thought, that people are burned out, that librarians are looking for exit plans, building nest eggs so that they can leave, any number of ways to leave the profession. And I did a talk a few weeks ago with a really wonderful NGO called Libraries Without Borders. And these folks are often in partnership with public libraries and do sort of library pop-ups and laundromats, and they do some really great outreach. And I was talking to their American staff on Zoom, and I could see everybody's face. And when I mentioned burnout and morale and overall anger within the profession, all the heads on the Zoom screen started doing the nodding thing, and I could see that out of the corner of my eyes. And I knew I wanted to return to that reaction when we spoke at the end. And a few of them spoke about how difficult it was to partner with libraries and librarians. And it was said with a lot of, like a great deal of empathy attached to it and understanding. And we just talked about how overwhelmed they are. And even though this is a group who's trying to come in and help, the librarians are just kind of at their wits' ends and feel really, really hopeless. And I think you're right to direct people to library Twitter and just the conversations that are happening over there. I am no longer in the field, but if you want a pulse on how people are feeling and what's happening out there, that is definitely a place to look.
I honestly don't look I mean, I
Yeah.
can't. I'm so saturated, but you can see plenty of examples on Twitter. We've seen enough. We've seen all that we needed to see. But yeah, so what do we do? Where do we go from here in terms of both fixing, the sort of internal problems with libraries being unsafe for workers, but how can we participate in the reckoning? I want to be part of this. What can we do?
Yeah, and that's a question that I get asked probably the most, and I feel like it's the one that I struggle the most with answering. But my ultimate hope with Overdue is that it gives enough information about what is happening and about the importance of this reckoning that people will be able to walk away from that with some ideas of their own of how to help. I do think it's important to note that librarians can't do it alone. And that it is going to take board members and politicians and administrators and people who are sitting here tonight for whatever reason listening to us to advocate and get a more nuanced and truthful story about libraries and library work out there. And it doesn't just have to do with caring about librarians and libraries, it has to do with caring about your community and the communities that you live in. I mean, libraries are a microcosm of so much that is happening. What about you? Do you have some tips for folks on how they can get involved?
Well, of course, but I love that your book points to, of course, the things we've touched on already a little bit, transparency. I think if any library administrators are listening, I hope that they take that to heart. But transparency is something that people on the outside, our community, we're going to need them to get that, to change the sort of situations librarians find themselves in terms of being silenced and not being able to talk about situations of violence when they occur, because honestly, it just makes things worse. So how do people help us with that? Ending the culture of silence, going towards transparency. If you live in DC, I believe it is your council members. If you live anywhere else, it is your representative. Get in touch. Libraries are organized differently and funded differently, and administered differently, depending. And a lot of these library boards are just independent citizens. So maybe some of our guests tonight will consider getting involved in their local library board. And that would be my advice for trying to fix it. And of course, reading this book is obviously a great idea. I think you have lots of good ideas in here. So I think we have like 5 minutes before we're supposed to open for questions. So what have we not touched on yet that you would like to talk about?
Oh, that's a good question.
Wild card. Woo!
Yeah. I actually think we did meet the point that we were supposed to go to.
Oh, did I? Oops.
Yes, you did it.
Okay. Woo, we did it.
But we made it to the point where we are ready to move into audience questions that have hopefully come in.
We've got some good ones, Amanda.
Hey.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's see. Are library patrons banned from libraries when they harass, do drugs, fight, or, for example, how things happen on transit systems?
So Meg mentioned at one point library rules of behavior, which is the official name in the DC Public Library for the rules. So there are definitely rules, and there are tiers to that and different levels of response. So yes, there is a system that you can go through where if someone does a certain type of infraction, there are generally rule books in most library systems that break down what the measure of punishment is, and that can be a short-term bar, like they're barred for the rest of the day because of something, and that can be up to a 5-year bar. So there are definitely there's a way to handle it that way, but it becomes complicated by who makes those decisions. And if this is a patron who you are familiar with who's having a bad day, it sort of sometimes comes down to the librarians and managers and administrators. It's a great question. Yeah. And it varies by library system.
It really does. And unfortunately, it usually involves the police. And we know that when someone is dealing with a mental health issue, the police are not always the best people to call. And so that becomes a whole other complicated issue, because a lot of times the only enforcement that or the only support that you're going to get is from the police, who might actually make the situation worse. So it's hard, because it's sort of like the resources to deal with an incident, a situation, are not necessarily appropriate for what's happening. So we've got a couple in here. Let's see. Ooh, I don't know if you want to answer this. What is the role? This is one that I don't know that I would answer so much, just to say, but it's the role. Do we want to talk about the American Library Association and their role in this? Do we?
I think we should touch it. I think we should gently prod it and touch it, or
okay.
I can. Again, I do dig into this a bit in the book, but the ALA is also an organization of people who, some of them are working librarians, some of them are not, some of them never had been. They offer many resources on their website. But I think the easiest answer to that is that we know that they could be doing so much more than they are. And not only that, they are sometimes doing more harm than good with some of their responses to many things, including the issue of racism within the field of librarianship. And so there's more about that in the book as well. But that is, yes, that is a tough one to touch with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, I won't say too much other than just to say I had some pretty bad experiences as a queer non-binary person in ALA, and I resigned, and I do not plan on joining again. So that's how I feel about it.
Yep.
Anyway, so an MLIS question. That's Master's in Library and Information Studies or Science for those who don't know. So there's talk about having an emphasis on social work content in MLIS degree programs. But what about the fact that we need supportive programs for these things outside of libraries too? And I think your book touches on that.
Yeah, and I think that answered the question, is that we do need both.
Yeah, both.
Yeah, we just need both, and but we definitely need to see more of both in both of those arenas in MLS programs and out there in the field.
Absolutely. And then I will say, just speaking of programs, I honestly think that my master's in women's and gender studies prepared me more for the profession of librarianship almost than my library degrees do, because library or like women's and gender studies taught me intersectionality and, the politics of location, how to try to understand that your entire perspective is based on who you are and where you are and how you were born and your class and your race and your gender. These are all things that librarians really should know. So if you can't go for social work, maybe go for women's and gender studies. I've got my women's and gender studies plug and everything. So in terms of programs, I do think that's like very compatible.
Yeah, and similarly to you, I don't have an MSW, but I started out my undergrad years going for a 5-year program of an MSW that I ultimately obviously did not do, but having that just some like basic courses towards the social work degree were more helpful in many ways than any course I ever took within my MLS program. And to touch back on the survey of librarians that I did, and I think there were 120 people who responded from every state and the District of Columbia, that was a universal response when I asked, do you think that your MLS program adequately prepared you for the work of being a librarian? Every single one of those librarians responded no. So I think that tells us a lot.
Yeah. I mean, and in some ways it is such a varied profession. Librarians do such different things. So if the programs aren't specific enough, it's almost like, I don't even know what kind of curriculum reform. I think we are going to see in the future possibly more of these either dual degree or, kind of companion degree programs, just because I can't imagine the amount of curriculum reform that it would require. But I would certainly love to help with that.
Anyone's listening who can make that happen.
I have so many ideas. So this is a question that I feel like the answer is also kind of embedded. Two people. Okay, so what kind of care services do these the librarian social workers, like what do they offer the homeless? And I think like when we're talking about the social workers, it's different because libraries, as we know, are not offering that much. But like, so what do the librarian social worker, like what kind of things were they offering like in those pilot programs?
I think a big piece of it is that they're much more familiar with some of the paperwork that goes into receiving services. And I do not mean this in any way to disparage library social workers, but a lot of the work that they're doing are things that librarians are already doing. And it's to take some of that work off of the librarians and have someone who specializes in that, who comes in and that's their sole responsibility, because of course librarians are doing that much of the social work in addition to everything else that is required out of the day of being a librarian. So in many ways, most librarians sort of have a low-key MSW, and we know how to fill out those forms and who to direct people to, but library social workers can come in and take some of that work off the shoulders of library workers. And that's not to say all librarians are equipped to do that, but many of us, it's a very much a learning once you're in the profession field.
Yeah. And we are, as you say in your book, so many of us are helpers, and that is what drew us to the field. And so we want to help, we do as much as we can, but unfortunately, sometimes things are just totally beyond, our skill set. I mean, I will say I've helped people with those forms to get services, any kind of service that you need, it is a lot. It is so complicated, and we definitely need more and more resources in that.
Like something just to give people a visual of that happens, and it often happens at the circulation desk, and you are there and there is a line and someone comes up with a very complex need or question, and librarians often have to make the really heartbreaking decision to say, I can't help you with that right now. Or once I'm finished here, I will try and come into the computer lab and I will try and sit with you with that. But we are prepared a lot of the time. We have gathered the resources. I know that the branch that I worked at, we had an entire packet full of places where people could get clothing, places where people could shower, nearby shelters, including walking directions to them. We had resources, but it often became having the time and the space in the day to do some of that really important work that, of course, we all wanted to do, but there are limitations, and that's not even digging into the empathy fatigue and the personal feelings around helping people.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and that kind of leads into we have a couple questions here about the police presence in libraries. Nobody in this chat is a fan. We are not a fan. Police presence in libraries is mostly negative, or almost always negative, and generally leads to escalation and more problems. Can you talk a little bit about what alternative support within libraries would look like when staff doesn't feel safe?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think we really need to be thinking about reimagining. I first just kind of want to speak a little bit more to police presence in libraries, and I can speak to DC. And I imagine that there are many attendees tonight who live in the DC area. And it's important to know that the DC Public Library has employed gun-carrying police officers. I meant to look up the year before we started and I forgot, but it is since, I believe, 1976. It might be 1986. So we're talking decades long. And that is just so rife with issues that I definitely do unpack in the book. What I would love to personally see, and maybe Meg, you have some thoughts too, is someone who's maybe an advocate who is more formally trained in de-escalation and trauma-informed care, who is also hired with the money that libraries absolutely, in many cases, have to be a presence in the library that is more of a peacekeeper than a law enforcement officer. And I just think there are so many different better ways that we're exploring as a country right now of how to provide better community care that does not involve armed police officers. Do you have thoughts, Meg?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking too about, library workers who are feeling unsafe as well as feeling needed to be guarded. And I'm thinking that something that I just wanted to be sure to say was that most libraries don't have a union. I do, right? But most libraries do not have a union. In terms of getting those protections in place, something like that can be very important. So start a union, join your union. And then the other thing in terms of safety that has been for personal safety, as if you are a library worker, for me, it has been my colleagues and the employee organization, LC Globe, for the queer folks at the library. And really, they're the only ones who will be able to understand and be witness to what you're all going through. And so that's been, just for me personally, something that I have had to deal with when things are really, really rough. So that's just my perspective from my experience feeling unsafe.
Yeah, and I think we're both very lucky that we do have, and I had coworkers that were with us in that work. And I don't know if they're here tonight, but I do want to shout them out if they are, that I was so lucky to work on a staff that looked out for each other so much. And the safest I felt was just knowing that if things got really bad, that I had their support. So yeah, coworkers and belonging to different organizations definitely helps.
That's also part of what's made the pandemic so hard, is not having access to always to your people at the library. Shout out to Leroy Bell if he's out there. He's my work bestie. I haven't seen him in 2.5 years. So coming up, we're going to see each other soon, but I almost, the pandemic made me realize how much we take for granted these informal networks of support that we create at work. So shout out Leroy, I miss you. Oh, let's see, more questions. We're running out of time. So let's see. Did you see the movie The Public, and what was your reaction to it? Don't you write about that in here? Do you?
I do, but I wrote an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about that. Emilio Estevez and I are friends on Facebook now, and he sent me a very lovely message. Just as a side note, Coach Bombay likes me. So I wrote an op-ed in response to going to see that movie. And I think that they, in many ways, did a very decent and full job of presenting a much more realistic version of libraries and library work. And it was such a relief to see something on the big screen and in the media that was not this romanticization and hokey, glasses wearing, cardigan wearing, shushing librarian. And I think there was certainly a Hollywood aspect to it. If anyone has seen it and remembers the last scene, that would never happen. But yes, I think that was brilliant progress. And just in talking to Emilio, he cares very deeply about libraries and librarians and the work that they're doing. And he's actually a really fantastic advocate for a lot of what we've talked about tonight.
Absolutely. I think we probably have time for one last question here. Oh, we're not going to get to them all. It's okay. Oh, this is so much pressure to pick the last question.
I love that I can't see it.
Oh my gosh. Let's see. Well, this one is, I think we can answer pretty quickly. How can we be better library patrons and advocate on behalf of library workers?
I think saying anything at this point is great, and sharing things. Yeah, speak up about what you've learned. And I think the more we can get out, I think people are already doing a great job around understanding that libraries are much more than just books, but we have a long way to go. I think Meg shouted out some really great hashtags to follow on Twitter. Meg, what else you got?
Well, besides the hashtag protect library workers, I'm trying to think if there are any other really good ones out there. I'm not sure. Let's see.
There's lots of, I think the biggest takeaway would be to speak up, to pay attention. Meg and I mentioned pay attention to where the funding is going. I think that's pretty obvious. And certainly you can reach out at the administrative level. Library websites tell you who works there. Send an email, let them know you're not cool with where the money's going. That is your tax dollars. And we love to talk about like how happy we are that our tax dollars go to things like libraries mixed in with all that. But you have a say in that.
Absolutely. Someone else suggested the hashtag library life.
Yeah, that's a good one. My personal just favorite, as a side note, and I don't know what you'll get out of it, is hashtag Saturday librarian. And that is for librarians in public libraries who have to work on Saturdays. Me too, when I was doing it. And that's just a funny one if you want some lighthearted, but also scenes of really what the work looks like and what we encounter, especially on the weekends. Saturday librarian's a favorite. Brad just popped up.
Hashtag librarian problems. That one is funny too. A little bit of seriousness, a little bit of levity, a good balance. Hi, Brad.
Hi, our busiest day at the bookstore are Saturdays. So
there it is.
Good job moderating, Meg. And Amanda, it's impossible to read your book or listen to you talk and not be moved by all that you reveal about libraries and library work. And I hope your book does lead to greater public awareness. There's the cover. and also more resources to make working in a library more sustainable.
Yeah.
To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Overdue. See, I have one also. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.
Thank you.